Hello you, thank you for checking out the video, and if you're new here, welcome to the channel. This is Sho, and it has been 28 years since the release of Live Alive on the Super Nintendo, and honestly it has been too long. Live Alive has been one of those games that as an old school JRPG fan, I am extremely happy has gotten a second life. With that said, perhaps you might be thinking, what is Live Alive and why is everyone going on about it? Well, in this TAC review where we dive into a game's tactics, AI, and cheese, we're going to immerse ourselves in the interconnecting narratives of Live Alive. Live Alive, yes, that's how the katakana is written, is an old school JRPG of the 90s that has been given the HD 2D treatment a la Octopath, Traveler, and Triangle Strategy. The game itself is in some ways very similar to the Saga series, where you will take control over 7 different protagonists in different time areas with their own distinct stories, which eventually link together through the chains of fate. Honestly, going past that is getting into spoilers, however, do note that the eras are extremely distinct. These range from far future space traveling, a la Aliens, to prehistoric times, a la 10,000 BC. Each story is extremely unique in its presentation and mechanics, and from the outside might seem to lack real cohesion when lined up with everyone else's story, but by the end, the connections can be easily identified and you will see the bigger picture. Honestly, I really can't stress this enough. Each story is unique in its narrative approach, gameplay, gimmicks, and even art style. So when you jump into a world, you're really entering into something special. Getting into the specs, the visuals are absolutely beautiful. The HD 2D designs always appeal to old school gamers such as myself, so if you enjoyed Octopath graphics, you're gonna be at home. This may not be well known, but each of the 7 main characters' designs and worlds were actually designed by 7 famous manga artists from that era, back in the 90s. One of which being Gosho Aoyama, the creator of Detective Conan, or Case Closed, as you may know it. This, for me at least, adds a further level of appreciation in the design with the worlds, keeping that special visual feel as you uncover each protagonist's story. Audio-wise, this is old school Yoko Shimomura of Kingdom Hearts fame, which is excellent. Still some great 90s era JRPG bangers. I personally like Megalomaniac, which is the final boss theme, really good stuff there. Additionally, this version is fully voiced in English and Japanese with a solid cast for both. I will make a point here that the English localization does have a lot of extra additions that the original Japanese script didn't have. This is mostly to help convey the characters' personalities in a more Western approach. However, when listening to the Japanese with English text, you may have some dialogue bubbles that rush through fairly quickly. This is just because the Japanese uses more nuance in its expressions that the English has to elaborate on. Performance-wise, this is a smooth game. I had 0 issues with glitches, drops, bugs, and so forth. The only point of issue seems to be that these dialogue boxes that I mentioned before are auto-synced with the Japanese voiceover. So if you listen to the Japanese, but keep the English text, some boxes may close prematurely if you're on autoplay mode. This is definitely the case when the English adds that more text to contextualize the character's thoughts. For me, I found this quite often during the Wild West and Far Future chapters, so just a heads up. Otherwise, you should not worry at all about the performance. To keep things concise, I'll break down the tactics into 2 parts, the main battling system and then the actual gimmicks of each chapter. As the battle system is uniform across all of the chapters, let's just start there. Battles take place on a 7x7 grid and are a combination of action with, an active time battle gauge, which is displayed above all characters and units in battle. Essentially, any and all actions impact this bar, and the general amount of time used will be displayed in every single skill's tooltip. Speaking of skills, a wide variety of skills and actions are available based upon whatever characters you are using in your active party. As per typical JRPGs, these skills are pretty straightforward, with some of them having elemental or status effects, buffs, debuffs, healing, and so forth. When you select the skill, you'll see its general damage output, time consumption, any bonuses it may give, and of course its range. Do note that many skills have a variety of ranges, with some only having diagonal hits, some jumping over spaces, and some basically just clearing out entire sections of the tile. Additionally, speaking of those tiles, some skills can impact the tiles themselves by leaving some form of elemental damage traps or healing situations, so keep your eyes open as enemies can also impact the battlefield. Otherwise, there's not really much else to say. In some of the later chapters, you have the ability to manage items and equipment, and party formations to help fights. In all, though, it's just a very traditional old-school JRPG. As for the gimmicks, they are simple to understand but very critical in application. The game relies heavily on these in each story to make it unique through various mechanics and narrative devices, so let's get through them quickly. Prehistory is mostly centered around item collection and crafting. You're introduced to the system fairly early on, and as prehistory is kind of traditional in its style, you'll be needing to do a lot of collecting and crafting to break your progress easily. Imperial China then shifts to a more character simulator system, a la maybe Princess Maker if you're familiar with that. You'll be in charge of 3 disciples, and you'll need to train them, teach them, and guide them to become your successors. This is done through a lot of battles and some various training minigames and systems. Moving to classical Japan, we turn the game into Tenchu Stealth Assassins, with arguably one of the most expansive open world options I've ever seen. The main system requires a stealth mechanic that has you navigate a castle in search of your target. By pressing the Y button, you can cloak yourself, becoming completely invisible. Using the system, you can navigate past cards and other people that are looking throughout the castle. The Wild West, interestingly, shifts the game to a puzzle strategy game. You'll need to collect items and then assign key members of a town to produce different traps. These traps are then used to make your individual battles at the end of the chapter a lot more easy. The key here is basically getting the items and gear that you need, and then taking advantage of everyone's strengths and weaknesses. Then, if this wasn't a big enough shift, the present day turns, Live Alive into a fighting game that has you choosing and defeating your opponents while trying to learn their special moves as your own skills. So you'll need to experiment with different combinations to see if you can trigger the skills you need to learn. The near future then is, at least in my opinion, the least innovative. There's a mind reading mechanic that is added that allows you to access information in people's thoughts, which is sort of the core narrative device that allows your progress. Additionally, the game also brings back item crafting from prehistoric times and some of the Wild West puzzle mechanics to navigate to the challenges. The far future is then probably the most grounded. There's no fighting, rather it plays out like a mystery novel of sorts, a la Aliens, and really requires you to talk to the right people at the right time to progress. In summary, the game focuses on a lot of simple 90s era mechanics that veterans of JRPGs are all too familiar with. With that said, the unique expressions of each chapter allow for an extremely charming experience that makes each route feel uniquely special. As for newcomers, these mechanics are in some ways dated but intuitive. After a few repeated battles and practice, you'll start seeing ways to exploit the systems. The interesting thing about Live Alive is how the challenges present themselves. The game has no difficulty selector. Rather, it's through the aforementioned gimmicks that the challenges present themselves. For instance, the Wild West difficulty is pretty much contingent on how well you set your traps. Challenges during the Imperial China chapter are based on how and who you decide to train. For this reason, in many cases, there are optimal strategies for each section that allow you to get through the first acts of the games very smoothly. Now, while I don't want to spoil the final acts of the game, there are late game systems that you can utilize to help even the playing field. So, when it comes down to it, all challenges boil down to you and how you choose to approach the chapters. Therefore, veterans of 90s era JRPGs will likely figure out the optimal routes from using old school meta. Whereas newer players to JRPGs may have some issues during certain chapters. However, do note that all chapters can be restarted if needed, allowing you to take a different approach with the information you have previously gained. Despite this game never having a Western release, there are fan translations and quite a few guides made for it. What I'll do here is to provide the core cheese for each route without going too deep into the full extent. Honestly, each chapter can get its own video on how to break it. Prehistory. This is all about crafting and a certain minigame. In the original game, there was a room minigame where you needed to talk to 20 people and you receive some items that you would use for upgrading when you do this. In this version, if you check the room next to where you start, there's a caveman that will ask you to find the most or least of a group. After you trigger this minigame, you'll watch NPCs run into haystacks, and then you'll need to provide him the answer of what he's looking for. Giving him the correct answer nets you a bunch of items used for crafting. Do this minigame 5 or 6 times, maybe even more, and then jump into it. In particular, a good recipe is to use your starting rock and bone to make a stone knife, and then combine that stone knife with a stick to make a spear that grants you 25 attack and 10 speed. This can be done before you even speak to the Elder. You can also craft armors, boots, and headgear here as well to really start the chapter with some high power gear that will basically take you almost to the end of the chapter. Imperial China is best approached by keeping to a single pupil. It really doesn't matter which of the 3 you pick, just choose one and focus 100% on them. You will need to have one of them superpowered to carry through the latter part of that section. Classical Japan, this is way too broad to discuss. Just know that killing 0 people and using stealth all the way nets you with a plus 40 attack sword at the end of the chapter. Don't worry about the spotting chapter. You can get spotted, you can even enter into a battle. If this happens, just run away, don't kill anyone. The Wild West. This relies on knowing where the items and the stats of the townsfolk. So honestly, it's probably worth its own video. I would basically just check some guides on game FAQs because there's a few of them that actually help with this. Knowing where the items are, and then in terms of people's like strengths and weaknesses, it's pretty straightforward. You kind of have an idea on who is good at what. The present day. This actually isn't really like a fighting game, it's more like Mega Man. So I would start with the Hawaiian sumo wrestler and get his skills, then I would move on to Tula and then Moribe. After that, you should be able to navigate the rest of the fighters fairly easily. The near future. This honestly doesn't really have any specific cheeses early on, but I would suggest farming levels right after leaving the share house. You get really good XP up until around levels 12, 13, 14, which helps pushing through a good amount of the chapter. Also, you have a lot of item crafting that comes back about midway through, so do take advantage of that. The far future, this doesn't really have any major gimmicks or things that would break your run. If you get lost, just try talking to everyone around you. In the later parts of the chapter, I would say save often, and then try to have a good idea of the ship's layout, taking full advantage of the map on where you need to go. Live Alive is special. A classic that never officially reached the West, that was the directorial debut of Takahashi Tokita of Final Fantasy IV fame, and the first JRPG that Yoko Shimomura of Kingdom Hearts fame scored. This game represents the breakout works of many well-known masters of the JRPG, packaged in an updated style that modern JRPG fans can somewhat relate to. Now, for some, these systems may seem a bit outdated. Again, it was designed in the 90s, but for others, it's an excellent portal back to the golden age. So I would encourage you, at the minimum, to try the free demo to get a feel of the game, especially if you're on the fence. Otherwise, please enjoy this classic JRPG. Alright, well, thank you so much for making it to the end of this video. I definitely enjoyed going through this one. Depending on how things go, I may post a few more videos on how to approach some of the puzzles or systems in a little bit more depth. However, we shall see. In the meantime, if you enjoyed this content, please drop a like and let me know which route you find to be the most interesting. I personally love Cube's Far Future route with the kind of narrative experience and the lack of battles. And yeah, let me know in the comments below. If you'd like to really send your love and help out the channel, please subscribe. It's the best way to support the channel's growth. And yeah, thank you so much for sending your love as always. I really appreciate it. Well, this is Show, and I guess remember, if things get too tough, just switch strats. Cheers!